Today we're going to be talking about the two most popular DNA companies, which are AncestryDNA and 23andMe. DNA kits have become increasingly popular over the last few years. They are one of the most popular holiday gifts. With Mother's Day coming around, of course, there's sales on almost all of these kits, which makes them even more popular. So before we get started, what exactly is DNA? DNA is in every living cell of our body. It's divided into chromosomes and then further into genes. Every person has 23 pairs of chromosomes. You inherit 23 from each parent, so you have 46 in total. The 23rd chromosome is either an X or a Y. This determines if you are male or female. So women have 2 X chromosomes and men have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. A few things to keep in mind also if you're going to do a DNA test. When it comes to ethnicity, countries and their borders do not matter. The results are listed by regions. This is because the boundaries of various countries have changed so much over time. And you can have different ethnic groups that exist in different regions. So just because you have an ethnicity of Italian, French, German, that doesn't mean that your ancestors lived solely in that country. It just means that most of them were of that ethnicity. Results are based off of reference populations from those who are alive today. So every company has various reference populations. Your DNA does not change, but how your DNA is interpreted can change. And also, DNA can be tested in 3 different ways. You can have autosomal, Y-DNA, or mitochondrial DNA testing. So when you start to do your DNA, a lot of people do it for ethnicity, but others do it to try to find connections to their ancestors. So this is an example of how many ancestors do you have? Every generation doubles as you go further back. And as you see, this is just an estimate of perhaps when you were born going back. You have 32 of your 3rd great grandparents, 64 for your 4th great grandparents, and 128 for your 5th great grandparents. So if that's any indication, and then of course, if you go back centuries and centuries, you can have over 1 million, actually way more than that, ancestors. One thing to also keep in mind though, is you could have a set of ancestors more than once. So that can decrease the numbers a little bit. This is an example of known ancestors versus possible. This is actually from Krista Cohen's family tree. So even though we know that each generation doubles, you might not know all of those ancestors. For example, once she gets to her 3rd great grandparents, even though there should be 32, as far as those who she's been able to identify are 30. Only 45 out of 64, 75 out of 128, and so on. So even though for 7th great grandparents, you should have over 1,000, she has only been able to identify 365, which this is very common trying to get back that far. This is a quick showing of the 3 types of DNA testing. So autosomal DNA is inherited from all of your ancestors, which we'll talk about more for each of these. Y-DNA is inherited from your male lineage. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited from your female lineage. So while I'm talking about the autosomal DNA, these are some interesting diagrams that have been created recently, which kind of show how this DNA works. Autosomal DNA is inherited from all of your ancestors. It is found in the first 22 pairs of chromosomes. Because this is inherited from each ancestor, you will have some amount of information for each one. The catch of this is that it's only reliable for about 4 to 6 generations back, because every time it's passed down, it's divided. So that means you have less and less of the further generations going back. Autosomal DNA is how your ethnicity is predicted by those regions, of course. And most DNA tests today that people do are for the autosomal DNA. This is another diagram of the random recombination. So even though you get 50% DNA from each parent, and of course 25% from grandparents, and about 13.5 and so forth, it doesn't mean that their ethnicity would have been 100% or 50-50. So you can inherit random recombinations of each type of their ethnicity. So this is showing that the original ancestors, if they were each 100% of one ethnic group, as it passes down, even though each child, each child has about 50%, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a full 50% of each one. So you can see how this goes down. So again, this is that diagram for Y-DNA versus mitochondrial. So Y-DNA is in males only. It's passed down from every father to their son, so it changes very little over time. This can provide a list of matches who share a common direct paternal ancestor within 25 generations. So if you think how far back that can go, the catch to this is when you're going back, it's typically done by surname. So you'll have Y-DNA projects for individual surnames typically. But if perhaps you go back 5 generations and you think that your third great grandfather is the son of the man who claimed him, but he's not, that Y-DNA is going to stop right there. So this will go back so far, and it does not change much over time, and that's how you can trace back thousands of years. Mitochondrial DNA is also called mDNA or mtDNA. This type of DNA is passed from mother to her children. That's why you see kind of the orange there. So it goes to all of her children, but men do not pass this down. Excuse me. There's no recombination as it's passed down, so it stays the same. And so this could provide a list of matches who share common direct ancestors back to 52 generations. Mitochondrial DNA is very important when trying to figure out where your original ancestor originated. So it provides ancestral migration routes of your direct maternal line, stretching back thousands and thousands of years. And this mitochondrial DNA will also have the information for your haplogroup. So for men, they will actually be able to show their haplogroup for their mother and their father, whereas women only have the haplogroup from their mother. Currently, the only test company that does Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA is Family Tree DNA, but these kits are very expensive and much more scientific. So now we're going to look at one of the top selling, which is AncestryDNA. It's actually a latecomer to DNA testing, but because it's such a large genealogical society, it's grown very fast. There are over 18 million who have tested with AncestryDNA, so that is quite a large pool. They only do the autosomal test. Here you can see 3 sisters who have each done their DNA, and 2 of the sisters are very similar, but the other is a little bit different. The percentages are there that aren't in the other 2. So you have the first 2 sisters that are both 52% England and Northwestern Europe. And then a close percentage for Scotland. And I will say this is one thing that confuses many people. The way Ancestry does this is because they list the name of it as if it was the country instead of the ethnicity. So it should say Scottish, Irish, Welsh, Norwegian, Swedish, and so forth, instead of having the name of the country. And that's what is confusing to several people. So the Scottish percentage is actually very close in all three sisters. The Irish is higher in the third sister. And she has a few different ethnicities that are not listed in the other two. And this just shows how that recombination is passed down. So even though all three of these sisters have the exact same parents, they don't share the same DNA just because it has been passed down and changed through each one of them. The only people who will have the exact same DNA are identical twins. This is an example of ancestry for a mother and a daughter. So you know that 50% of your DNA comes from your mother and 50% from your father. So you can kind of add up these percentages. One thing Ancestry did away with a couple of years ago is the smaller percentages. So almost anything under 2%, they have just kind of done away with. So not everything will add up, or at least they will round it up into a different ethnicity. So the mother is 52% England and Northwestern Europe, whereas the daughter is 50% European Jewish. And you see how that is not anywhere on the mothers. So you can assume that the 50% European Jewish is from the father. And then you see a slight bit of variation for the other ones. There's absolutely no Scottish or Irish in the daughters, whereas the mother has quite a bit, or Welsh. Norway, she does have quite a bit of the same percentage as her mother, and Germanic Europe is very similar in both. So that's an example of types of DNA or ethnicities that were not passed down to the daughter. Some pros of AncestryDNA is it's the best for finding the most matches because so many of them have tested with it. And because it's a genealogical website, you're able to link your DNA to your family tree. AncestryDNA claims to have the most regions tested with over 1,400. Most of these are more specific for Africa, South America, and Asia. Some of the cons of AncestryDNA is you have very limited options when comparing DNA matches. Because these are such popular gifts around the holidays, many people are given a DNA kit and they will do it, send it in, but they do not have an active account, so they don't answer emails, they don't create a tree. So their profile is very blank except for you're related to them and this is their possible ethnicity. So now we're going to look at 23andMe. This is the same mother and daughter. And here, again, one thing that 23andMe does is they do percentages in decimals. So it is broken down much further than Ancestry. So Northwestern European for the mother, it has 98%, but then it breaks it down further into regions. So you notice it says British and Irish instead of Great Britain, Ireland, things like that. And that one is 84%, 0.8. And then they have French, German, 6.5. And it's very important to realize, again, these are regions, they are not countries. So France, Germany, as we know it today, has not been like that. Those borders have gone back and forth. Here, there is a 1% Scandinavian for the mother. And notice it's 1%. So on Ancestry, it typically doesn't show anything less than 2%. And they do have broadly Northwestern European because it's a combination of very low percentages. So therefore they do put it in that category. And then for Southern European, she has 0.7 Spanish and Portuguese. One thing that is slightly interesting is it shows 0.2% Ashkenazi Jewish for the mother, but this is the only test that has shown up, and it is a very small percentage. So it means that that is probably many generations back, possibly even a dozen back. The way that 23andMe is able to do this is they actually do a combination of the autosomal, mitochondrial, and the Y-DNA to a certain extent. There's also, for sub-Saharan African, she has 0.5% of that, and it breaks it down actually twice so that you can see what area that is. For the daughter, again, 49.9 Ashkenazi Jewish, which that is pretty close to being exactly 50%. For the Northwestern European, notice it's 47.3% for the British Irish, which is close to being half of what the mother has. 2.3% of the French German. And then down at the bottom, it's got, again, the broadly Northwestern European. And I wasn't able to show the smaller percentages without making it too small to read, but she also has the sub-Saharan African as well. And at the very bottom, the unassigned, which is 0.1%, almost everybody is going to have that. And it just means that it is such a low percentage, it cannot be narrowed down to a specific region. And real quick, some of the things about 23andMe, it started out for health purposes, but you can choose to do just the ethnicity portion or the health test for a bit of a higher price. I mentioned that this company does the 3 types of the DNA, and by that you can actually see your haplogroup that is only inherited from the mitochondrial DNA. And again, for men, they're going to have a haplogroup for mitochondrial DNA and the father's DNA as well. Women only have the haplogroup from the mitochondrial since they do not inherit that Y chromosome. There are over 227 populations tested. The 23andMe is more specific for European and Asian ethnicities, and about 10 million, actually more than 10 million individuals have tested with 23andMe. So as you can see here, even though they don't have as many populations tested, they do break them down much more specifically than Ancestry does. It will also show timelines, which is very interesting. So it will break down those ethnicities and give you an estimate of how many generations back those came about. So the mother, you see the British Irish, and it's very recent. And so that tells you that, and again, a large portion of her family was that. It means that it does not necessarily go back as far, but that is the predominant ethnicity. The French German, it would probably be around from 1840 back to 1750. And these estimates are based on how much DNA is inherited. For the daughter, the first one is the Ashkenazi Jewish, which again, that was nearly 50% of her DNA. And then I believe it was 47% was the British Irish, so that goes for the second highest. And then the third highest of that ethnicity was the French and German. One of the pros of 23andMe is that they have chromosome painting. I'm one that I particularly like the visuals like this. And so when you're comparing to a relative on 23andMe, it will show you where your shared DNA segments are, which that's very interesting. It will also break down how you're related to close relatives. So the daughter had been tested with the mother, but no father, or at least he was not able to test. So this shows the breakdown for 50% of the father, which 49.9% Ashkenazi Jew and 0.1% Northwestern European. And those are pretty much percentages that she shares as well. For the mother, because we have her DNA, it is able to see what DNA was inherited by the daughter, and it will take that other 50% and attribute it to the father. And this will work both ways if you've tested with your father, but not your mother. So that is something that is very helpful, especially if, say, you only knew one parent. That can help you break down what ethnicity the other unknown parent was. This is an example of how AncestryDNA versus 23andMe will look beside each other. Again, you've already seen each of these, but this is just showing it a little bit differently. So percentages are very similar because each kit will do different regions. It's going to break down a little bit. So if you notice Ancestry, they list it as Germanic Europe, where 23andMe will have French German, which those are basically the same areas, but 23andMe breaks it down into that trace DNA or trace ancestry as well. So it has those smaller percentages. This is an example of the chromosome painting. So on the left side, you have all of the percentages. And then on the right, it is showing you where that DNA is specifically on which chromosome and for which parent, which this is very specific. The bottom chromosome is your paternal line, and the top chromosome will be your maternal line. So if you're able to see the colors, the 49.9% is Ashkenazi Jew, which that would have come from the father. And there's only one segment that has a bit of a difference, which would be right here. So that would be that 0.1% of European. The mother had quite a bit of various DNA. So the daughter has inherited 49.7 Northwestern Europe, which you can see from that. But then also the French German was or Germanic Europe, that was the second highest. So you can see right here that this particular chromosome is completely of the French German. And then you have a few others that will have it in there and down here. So that is the second highest. And you can see this is the one that the trace ancestry, so it's Nigerian, and it is on 2 different chromosomes from the mother's side. I believe the mother might have been 0.5%. And so when you're comparing a relative, you can also see where the DNA segments are shared like this. So you can click on one of these and it will show you where that DNA is in the chromosomes, and you can see how that's similar to your DNA matches. The cons to 23andMe are that there's no family tree to aid in genealogical aspects of DNA, but you can get a prediction of what generation your common ancestor is in. And that kind of helps so you can see a difference. It doesn't necessarily say what type of cousin. They do a prediction of that, but it tells you the exact percentage of how many centimorgans you have in common with a DNA match. Whereas if it's anything further from a parent, a sibling, or half sibling on Ancestry, it typically goes into cousin states. So you might have an uncle, but they are listed more as a first cousin. So 23andMe can tell you better who your common ancestor is. So that's pretty much the sum of this. If you have any questions, please let me know. And the final thing that I'll share is that 23andMe is best for genetic testing, comparing matches, and seeing a breakdown of your ethnicity and heritage. And then AncestryDNA is best for connecting with others who are interested in genealogy and expanding their family tree, at least for most of those. So it depends what you're wanting to do with your DNA and your results as to which kit you use. Thank you, and just let me know if you have any questions.